In general, the term for all of the hormonal influences and cyclical changes that take place in the female can be referred to as the female reproductive cycle. But we must understand that the female reproductive cycle can be separated up into more than one different cycle. We have the ovarian cycle and we have the uterine cycle. The ovarian cycle is specifically going to look at the process of maturation and the changes that are taking place in the oocyte, while the uterine cycle more so refers to the changes that are taking place in the endometrium, the innermost lining of the uterus. The uterine cycle roughly lasts about 28 days on average, so we can generally say that the uterine cycle lasts 1 month. The uterine cycle is also referred to as the menstrual cycle, as it begins with menstruation and the sloughing off of the endometrium. We are going to break down the events that take place in the uterine cycle, but we're first going to discuss the activities that are involved in the ovarian cycle. Bear in mind that the ovaries in females are homologous to the testes in males. These are the primary sex organs that produce sex cells and also release the sex hormones as well. So despite the apparent differences between those structures, we will see some similarities. First and foremost, wrapping around the ovary is what's known as the ovarian mesothelium. This is the surface epithelium of the ovary, and it's going to wrap around the tunica albuginea. You can see that tunica albuginea shown right here. The tunica albuginea is superficial to the ovarian cortex, and as we've seen with many different organs, the cortex is the outermost portion, which you can see out here. We're also going to have an ovarian medulla, which will be found in here. There isn't any clear dividing line between the cortex and the medulla, but we can tell the difference because the connective tissue in the medulla is more loosely arranged than it is in the cortex. Now, located inside of the ovarian cortex are what are known as ovarian follicles, and there will be many different follicles that will be found in various stages of development. Ovarian follicles include the female gamete, the oocyte, and all of the follicular cells that will wrap around them. The most immature form of ovarian follicles is the primordial follicle, which will develop into a primary follicle, then a secondary follicle, and then as follicular maturation continues, we're going to have the mature or Graafian follicle. The mature Graafian follicle is just about ready to ovulate and release the oocyte out into the fallopian tubes. One thing that you can see here is that the oocyte itself is actually just found right here. And all of these other structures around the oocyte over here are made up of the follicular cells, and these are the other parts of the ovarian follicle. As follicular cells continue to develop, they're going to become granulosa cells. And on the next couple slides, you'll see the transition of follicular cells into granulosa cells. These ovarian follicles are going to undergo maturation, and concurrently, the process of meiosis is also going to be taking place in the oocyte. It is for this reason that we need to look at the ovarian follicle and also look at the oocyte separately. We will come to see that hormonal influences will lead to ovulation, and once again, ovulation is the release of the egg cell from the ovary. The mature Graafian follicle is in the stage that is preparing itself for ovulation. You can see that eventually, when hormonal influences peak, this ovarian follicle is going to release the egg cell, and it's then called the corpus hemorrhagicum. This released egg cell is going to enter into the fallopian tube and potentially be fertilized by sperm cells. But we also want to note that the remnants of the corpus hemorrhagicum become another structure known as the corpus luteum. And it is the corpus luteum that's going to play an extremely important role in the hormonal influences of the female reproductive cycle. The corpus luteum will release 4 different hormones, namely progesterone, estrogen, inhibin, and relaxin. And we're going to break down the roles of each of these hormones in just a few slides. In the event that fertilization does not take place, the corpus luteum will eventually degrade, and it will become what's known as the corpus albicans. And in the event this happens, the hormonal release by the corpus luteum ceases, and then during the next cycle, ovarian follicular development will continue on with other egg cells. There's a bit more anatomy of the ovarian follicle that we can see here, but I think what would be more appropriate is if we move on to these slides to get a better idea of what these structures look like and how we name the components of the ovarian follicle. So gametogenesis here in the female reproductive system is referred to as oogenesis. This is the homologous process to spermatogenesis that we saw inside of the testes. You can see that this is a section of one of the ovaries, and you've got lots and lots of primordial follicles, which are immature up here in the ovarian cortex. And as we start to move a little deeper, you can start to see the developing primary and secondary follicles. Thinking back to the process of spermatogenesis, we know that that process begins at puberty, and it is the release of gonadotropin-releasing hormone FSH and LH that stimulate that process. But in the female gonad, oogenesis is actually going to begin before the female is even born. The stem cells that can be found inside of the ovary are known as the oogonia, and the oogonia are going to be dividing before a female has even left her mother's womb. This process begins during development, but it's going to arrest at birth, until hormonal stimulation from puberty restarts the process of follicular development, and each month one of these ovarian follicles is going to be stimulated to develop the oocyte and release it. We can see on the left side here the structure of a primordial follicle and also a late primary follicle. First and foremost, each primordial follicle is going to have a primary oocyte that can be found in its center. It's going to have a singular layer of follicular cells that can be found wrapping around it, and then we're also going to have a basement membrane, and on the other side we find stromal cells, which are mixed in with collagen fibers. This is the simplest form of the ovarian follicle, and this is also how all of the ovarian follicles are at birth up until puberty. But at puberty, gonadotropin-releasing hormone is going to start releasing FSH and LH. And these two hormones are going to start developing the primordial follicles into primary follicles and secondary follicles. Every month, a few of these primordial follicles will be influenced by follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone, and so several of them are going to start developing into primary follicles. All of them will not reach maturation. Some of them are going to break down. But generally one follicle, known as the dominant follicle, will reach full maturation and eventually be ovulated out into the fallopian tubes. Through this hormonal stimulation, that's going to turn the primordial follicle into the late primary follicle, and we can already start to see some differences between these two stages. The first thing that we can notice is that the primary oocyte is going to be wrapped up in a new layer known as the zona pellucida. The zona pellucida is going to wrap around the oocyte, and it is this layer that the acrosome of the sperm cells will be carrying digestive enzymes for so that they can make their way in to penetrate the oocyte. We also see that single layer of follicular cells dividing rapidly, and when there's more than one layer of follicular cells, we're going to start to call these granulosa cells in here. The granulosa cells are eventually going to start releasing follicular fluid, and that will manifest in our secondary follicle. On the other side of the basement membrane, the stromal cells would have differentiated into theca folliculi, which are just theca cells found on the periphery of the ovarian follicle. In the secondary follicle, we can see that the granulosa cells are releasing follicular fluid, and it's accumulating to make this space known as the antrum. This is going to separate those granulosa cells, and it produces this little ring of cells right here, and this is eventually going to be called the corona radiata. So therefore, we're going to have a primary oocyte, a zona pellucida, and the corona radiata are the granulosa cells that are wrapping around the oocyte. The theca folliculi have differentiated at this point into a theca externa and a theca interna. And you can see another picture of the secondary follicle shown right here with a much larger antrum. Eventually, that secondary follicle is going to continue developing into the mature Graafian follicle. Here we're going to find a much larger antrum, and you can really see the corona radiata much better. We've got the zona pellucida around the oocyte, and we're still in the form of the primary oocyte. It is in the mature Graafian follicle that the primary oocyte is going to undergo meiosis I, and it's going to become what's known as a secondary oocyte. This is the follicle that is preparing for ovulation. What's going to happen is this follicle is going to rupture, and the oocyte, zona pellucida, and corona radiata are going to be released and eventually picked up by the fallopian tubes. As I just mentioned, it is in the form of the mature Graafian follicle that the oocyte will undergo meiosis I and produce a haploid secondary oocyte. This will be somewhat equivalent to the secondary spermatocyte that we saw formed from spermatogenesis. Now, considering spermatogenesis, we had a single primary spermatocyte producing two secondary spermatocytes. What's going to happen is that the primary oocyte is going to produce a secondary oocyte, but the other entity is what's known as the first polar body. This is going to be an inactivated entity, and its role in the body is not currently known. We will see that after meiosis II, we're going to produce another polar body. So the process of oogenesis actually only produces one viable gamete. The process of spermatogenesis produced 4 viable gametes, and oogenesis is only producing 1. So that's a very important distinction that we need to make about meiosis in both the male and the female. Now, I've already indicated that the corona radiata, the zona pellucida, as well as the secondary oocyte itself will be released from the ovary through ovulation and captured by the fallopian tube. So keeping our processes in mind, at the time of ovulation, we have a secondary oocyte that's completed meiosis 1, released into the fallopian tube, and the follicle has made it to the mature Graafian stage. At this point, it's technically the corpus hemorrhagicum, and it's going to eventually become the corpus luteum. But the secondary oocyte has only completed meiosis 1. In order to complete meiosis 2, what will be necessary is fertilization by a sperm cell. If sperm cells are present, one sperm cell is going to burrow in through the zona pellucida and be absorbed by the oocyte. At the moment that this happens, the cell is going to complete meiosis 2, and we're then going to call it an ovum. And at this point, the second polar body will have formed. The first polar body might even undergo its own cell division and produce a third polar body. But again, we want to focus more on the oocyte compared to the polar bodies. Now, inside of the ovum, we're going to now have the male pronucleus, and we also have the female pronucleus. Those are just referring to the genetic sets of chromosomes that can be found in each. Those are eventually going to unite, and that's when the ovum becomes a zygote. And it is the zygote that's going to have a new set of 46 chromosomes that never existed before. This slide will be useful to show us how oogenesis and follicular development are happening at the same time. We're first going to start in the fetal period before birth has even taken place. The oogonium are going to start dividing and producing primary oocytes. The primary oocytes are going to be found in these primordial follicles, and those are what are primarily going to be in existence before birth. The primary oocyte is going to arrest in prophase 1. At birth, the female will have all of the eggs that she will ever have. And again at puberty, once gonadotropin-releasing hormone starts to be released from the hypothalamus, that's going to release FSH and LH, which is going to continue this process and follicular development. Some primordial follicles every month will develop into primary follicles, which will further develop into secondary follicles and mature Graafian follicles. All the while, the primary oocyte is found in these follicles and are slowly undergoing the process of oogenesis. It is in the mature Graafian form that the primary oocyte will complete its first cell division in meiosis 1 and produce a secondary oocyte. This division also yields the first polar body, which might go off and divide again to produce the second and third polar body, but again, we don't want to focus too much on the polar bodies. We really want to keep our focus in here at the secondary oocyte. So eventually, through the stimulation of luteinizing hormone, that's going to stimulate the mature Graafian follicle to ovulate the egg cell. This will be released with the zona pellucida and the corona radiata attached around it. The secondary oocyte that's existing in here will eventually be making its way down the uterine tube, and it will only complete the process of meiosis 2 in the event that a sperm cell is going to fertilize it. If there's no sperm cell present, the oocyte will never complete the process of meiosis 2. But once fertilization takes place and the sperm cell penetrates, we're going to call that entity an ovum. And for a very short time, the nuclei inside of the ovum are separate. Shortly after this, they're going to fuse, and that's going to form the zygote. And it is the zygote that contains a new set of 46 chromosomes and will start the process of development inside of the female reproductive system.